In the winter of 1887, in the copper boom town of Harlan Bluff, Nevada, there stood on the corner of Sutter and 2nd Street a building that had not been entered in 11 years. Its facade was still handsome in the way of things that once had ambition, with pressed tin cornices above 4 tall windows, a painted arch above the entrance that had once read Harlan Opera House in letters of gilt and black, and a double door of walnut wood that the desert had warped half an inch out of true. The letters had faded to a suggestion of themselves. The walnut doors were padlocked through a hasp someone had bolted at an angle, as though in a hurry. And on the north wall of the building's interior, invisible from the street, stood a wall of brick 18 inches thick and 7 feet high, mortared solid sometime in the autumn of 1876, with no mark to say what it sealed, and no record anyone could find to explain why it had been put there at all. The wall was not the building's only secret. It was only the most obvious one. The woman who paid $4.50 for the right to investigate that wall arrived in Harlan Bluff on a Tuesday in March, when the wind off the desert still carried the cold of February and the mud in the streets had not yet decided whether to freeze or flow. Her name was Cecilia Marsh, and she was 28 years old, and she had come from Elko with $11 remaining to her name, a canvas satchel of tools her grandfather had left her when he died, and a working knowledge of masonry that almost no one in Harlan Bluff expected her to possess. She did not look like a woman who knew brick. The desk clerk at the Pioneer Rest noted her wool coat, her practical boots, the absence of any companion, and the steady way she laid 2 quarters on the counter without being asked. He asked if she was meeting someone, and she said she was not. He asked if she expected to stay long, and she said that depended on the wall. He did not know what to make of that, and she did not explain herself. And he gave her a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked north toward the desert and let the cold in at the sill seam. The auction was held on Thursday morning, on the frozen mud in front of the building itself, with perhaps 20 people in attendance, and a wind coming off the ridge that made everyone cold and impatient. The auctioneer, a man named Pratt, had the quick eyes and dry manner of a man who had disposed of too many things to feel much about any of them. He described the building in the terms the county records supplied: a commercial property of approximately 2,400 square feet on a corner lot, comprising a main hall with seating, a raised stage platform, a dressing room and storage space at the rear, in condition described as serviceable but in need of cosmetic repair. He did not mention the wall. The wall was not in the county records. He opened at $6. There was a silence that Cecilia waited out. A man in a sheepskin coat countered at $4, seemingly as a joke, and 2 others laughed. Cecilia raised her hand at 4.50 and kept it there. The man in the sheepskin coat looked at her, decided she was serious, and did not counter. The other bids that had been stirring at the edges of the crowd, the speculators and the curious, seemed to recalculate something and stayed quiet. Pratt knocked it down to her at $4.50 and looked at her afterward with an expression that she had seen on the faces of men who are being kind in the way that condescends. He said she had purchased something she could not possibly make use of. She thanked him. She tucked the receipt into her coat pocket and stood in the street looking at the building she now had the legal right to enter. And she thought about her grandfather. If you have ever held a tool that someone taught you how to use, a real tool, one with weight and a particular grip worn down by the hand that preceded yours, then you know something about the inheritance she carried. Her grandfather, Eli Marsh, had come to Nevada in 1858 as a stonemason from Pennsylvania, and he had built chimneys, cisterns, foundation walls, and a church steeple in 3 counties before his knees gave out. He had come west at the age of 32 with a trade and a box of tools and a set of opinions about lime mortar versus Portland that he would defend to anyone foolish enough to raise the topic. He had built part of the Harlan Building's own rear wall in 1872 for a contractor named Holt, whose correspondence Cecilia had found in a ledger at the county clerk's office 2 months earlier, the first thread she had pulled on the building's history. He had taught Cecilia to read masonry the way another man might teach a child to read print, attending to the set of a course, the weight of the mortar, the particular sound a hollow wall made when you struck it, and the particular sound a solid one made in return. A solid wall speaks low, he had told her once, in the dry, plain manner he used for things that mattered. A hollow wall speaks first. Listen to the one that answers too quickly. He had died in 1882, in a bed in Elko, with his hands still calloused and his voice still precise. And he had left her his tools because he knew she would use them. She spent the first afternoon on the building itself before she touched the wall at all. She moved through the ground floor slowly, the way Eli had taught her, with a pine-handled mallet in one hand and nothing hurrying her. The main hall still had its 44 seats, wood and iron, coated in a decade's worth of fine desert grit. The stage floor was solid pine with a slight forward pitch, dusty but intact. The plaster walls above the wainscoting had cracked in the standard vertical lines of desert settlement, nothing structural. She noted the iron wall sconces, the bracket holes where a curtain rod had once run, the single dressing room at stage left with its dressing table still in place, a ring of rust on the surface where a water pitcher had sat for years and evaporated and been replaced, and finally sat empty until it too was gone. She noted the heating stove in the back corner of the main hall, a cast-iron box of considerable size, well made, with a flue that still ran clean through the roof. She noted 2 things the building's records should have mentioned and did not: a second door frame visible in the northeast wall of the dressing room, mortared over with the same cream-colored brick as the wall on the stage, and a narrow gap of 3 inches between the ceiling of the backstage area and the outer wall where the brickwork simply stopped, as though whoever had laid it had run short of material or had been interrupted before finishing the top course. She stood and looked at that gap for a long time. She did not touch it. She took out her notebook and drew a diagram of the backstage area with measurements, noting the gap's position and the shadow it cast in the afternoon light. Then she put the notebook away and went to find the oldest person in Harlan Bluff who had been there when the Opera House opened. His name was Walt Seeger, and he was 64 years old, and he ran the combination hardware store and freight receiving office on the east end of 2nd Street. He had lived in Harlan Bluff since 1871. He had a face like weathered sandstone and a habit of polishing things he was not thinking about. And when Cecilia came into his store and told him what she had purchased and what she wanted to know, he reached under the counter for a bridle fitting and began polishing it without looking down. He had attended the Opera House's opening performance in May of 1873, when a traveling company from Sacramento had performed 2 acts of something he could no longer recall, and he had been in the building one other time, in September of 1876, when he had been hired along with 3 other men to carry certain pieces of furniture out of the backstage area, under the supervision of a man he described only as the Reno Man. Cecilia listened to this with her hands in her lap, sitting across the counter from Walt while the fitting circled in his palm. She asked him to describe the furniture they had carried out. 2 trunks, Walt said, a chaise, a vanity mirror on a walnut stand, a brass-fitted writing desk, and a cabinet of drawers he had not been permitted to open, which had been heavy enough that 2 men had struggled with it on the stage steps, and which had shifted on those steps in a way that suggested its weight was not evenly distributed, as though whatever was inside had been loaded in a hurry and then not adjusted. She asked him who had hired the Reno Man. Walt set down the fitting and looked at her directly for the first time. "The Percival Company," he said. The Percival Company was a name Cecilia had found 3 times in the building's public records at the county office, each time as the grantor in a deed or the principal in a contract, and each time followed by an address in Reno that, when she had checked it the previous autumn on a trip through town, turned out to be a vacant lot where a laundry had once stood. The company had purchased the Opera House from its original builder in August of 1876 at a price the deed listed as $840, which was below what the building had cost to construct. It had sealed the building in October of the same year. It had paid the property taxes every year since, through a Reno bank, in amounts that were correct to the cent and accompanied by no correspondence whatsoever. It had never answered a letter. It had never sent a representative, so far as anyone in Harlan Bluff could recall. It was not, in the ordinary sense, a company that did things. It was a company that held a building shut and paid the minimum required to keep it shut. And it had been doing so for 11 years. What had been in the building before October of 1876, other than a stage, 44 seats, and a set of iron sconces, was a question no one in Harlan Bluff had pressed hard enough to answer. Cecilia had come to press it. She started on the smaller wall first, the mortared-over doorframe in the dressing room. The brick there was the same cream-colored Nevada common as the stage wall. Same era, same mortar compound, and she worked on it the second morning with a cold chisel and a 2-pound hammer from Eli's satchel, moving course by course from the top down, keeping her strikes short and measured the way he had drilled into her. "Do not fight the brick," he had told her once, leaning on the handle of his own chisel in the cold air of a winter morning in Elko. "Read where it wants to give and go there. The brick that wants to come free will tell you. Listen to what your mallet hears." She listened. The mortar in the dressing room wall was of moderate quality, well mixed but not reinforced, and it had dried in the desert air to a condition that was hard on the outside and slightly chalky within. She worked the top course first, using the chisel at a shallow angle to undercut the mortar bed rather than drive through it, and the first brick came free cleanly at the hour mark, releasing a curl of cold air that smelled of stone and something else, a dry and faintly resinous smell she could not immediately name. She set the brick on the dressing room floor and worked the second course. By midday, she had removed 3 courses across the width of the frame, a space roughly a foot high and 2 feet wide, and she could see into the space beyond, a passage narrow and perhaps 3 feet across, running parallel to the north wall of the backstage area. The floor of the passage was concrete. The ceiling was raw timber. The walls were unplastered stone. She worked another 2 hours and opened the frame to the height of her shoulders, and then she took the pine-handled mallet and struck the wall of the passage at chest height, at intervals of 8 inches, moving slowly from the dressing room end toward the far end she could not yet see. Most of it answered with the flat sound of solid stone. At approximately the 30-foot mark, where her arm was fully extended and the light from the dressing room had thinned to suggestion, the wall answered differently. There was a low hollow in the return, a faint resonance beneath the stone's face, as though something had been packed behind it, or as though the stone itself was thinner there. She backed out and made a note of the distance and direction, and then continued removing the brick until she could step through into the passage standing. The passage ran approximately 30 feet and terminated at its far end in a wooden door that had been locked from the outside with an iron padlock that had rusted almost to a solid mass. The door itself was solid pine, 2 inches thick, hung on 3 iron strap hinges that had held true. She took the key from the collection that had come with the building purchase and tried the 3 that fit the padlock's shape. None of them worked. She went back to her room at the Pioneer Rest that evening, after noting the passage dimensions precisely in her notebook, and slept. The next morning, she spent 20 minutes on the padlock with a file from Eli's satchel, working the keyway until the internal mechanism freed itself and the shackle disengaged. It gave with a small sound, a click so quiet it seemed wrong for something that had held 11 years. The room beyond the door was small, perhaps 12 by 14 feet, with a low ceiling of rough-cut pine board. It smelled of wood and cold stone, and the dry, resinous smell she had caught in the passage, stronger here, like old cedar, and something that might have been linseed oil. There was no window. There was no furniture. There were, stacked along 3 walls from floor to ceiling in careful rows, crates, large ones, narrow and tall, roughly the dimensions of a dressed timber. Smaller ones of varying sizes, some no bigger than a bread box, others as large as a steamer trunk. All of them sealed with nailed lids, some strapped in places with iron banding that had only just begun to rust at the edges. She counted 31 crates before she stopped counting. She stood in the doorway for a full minute without moving. The cold in the room was deep and still, the cold of a space that had not changed temperature in years, that had held its dark at the same degree through 11 of 8 winters and summers, as though the outside world had ceased to have any claim on it. The dust on the crate lids was undisturbed. No mouse had gotten in. No water had come through the pine ceiling boards. Whoever had built this room had built it to keep. She thought of Eli. She thought of the way he had described a cache he had sealed in the foundation of a house in Lander County in 1871 and retrieved 7 years later, and the quality of his satisfaction when he found it unchanged, when the oilskin wrapping was intact and the paper beneath it was unbrowned. "You build the room for the thing that will wait in it," he had said, "not for yourself. You won't be there." She went back to find Walt Seeger. He came the following morning, pulling on his coat with the deliberate movements of a man who has decided to commit to something and does not intend to make a fuss about it. He stood in the door of the passage and looked in, and then he looked at Cecilia, and he said quietly that he had heard there was more than furniture. She said she expected he was right. She had, by then, opened one of the smaller crates, using a pry bar from her grandfather's satchel with the patient leverage Eli had always prescribed. Slow, even pressure, never a sudden jerk. Let the nails draw themselves. The crate's lid came off to reveal packing of fine-shaved pine curls, pale and dry and smelling of fresh wood, still after 11 years in that sealed room, and nested in the packing, wrapped in chamois cloth, were 6 pieces of silver flatware of a quality that had not been made for a traveling theater company, a serving fork and spoon of considerable size, 2 dinner forks, a ladle, and a small butter knife with a handle scrolled at the end. They were monogrammed. The monogram was a double P within an oval cartouche, the kind of mark a silversmith put on presentation pieces, the kind of mark that meant the set had been given as a gift. They were in almost perfect condition, with only the very faintest tarnish at the scrollwork. She wrapped them again and set them aside. Then she turned to the large crates at the back wall. What you understand about sealed wood in a room with a concrete floor and no moisture intrusion is that it keeps what it holds very well. Eli had known this. He had spoken about it with the authority of a man who had built sealed rooms for purpose, and not by accident. What Cecilia found in the tall crates at the back of the room was not silver and not furniture, but canvas. Paintings rolled and fitted into tubes of oilskin, some as large as 4 feet across, and others small enough to carry under one arm. There were 14 of them, and she unrolled 3 carefully in the narrow passage where the light from the dressing room reached, spreading them on the concrete floor and weighting the corners with small flat stones from the passage wall. What she saw on the canvas was good work, careful and specific, portraits and landscapes of the kind that cost money to commission and considerably more money to ship across a continent. The largest bore a signature in the lower right corner that she read twice before she accepted what she was reading. She set it down gently and pressed her palms against her knees and stayed like that for a moment. The portraits were of one family, a man, a woman, and a young girl. The man appeared in 7 paintings, in varying settings, in the careful middle ground posture of a subject who commissioned work but did not enjoy sitting for it. He was perhaps 50 in the earliest portraits, with a quality of contained restlessness, a man who had learned to hold still for the painter, but whose hands, in each picture, were doing something small. A pen, a folded paper, the arm of a chair gripped rather than rested upon. The woman appeared in 5, and she had a quality in her expression that the painter had caught with unusual precision, an alertness that was not quite happiness but was close to it, a quality of listening, of being poised on the edge of something that had not yet happened. The girl appeared in 4. She was perhaps 10 or 11 years old in the first, with the woman's eyes in a serious set to her mouth. In the last painting she was older, perhaps 15, and the painting was unfinished, the background sketched in charcoal and only partially committed to color. The figure complete, but the space around it merely suggested as though the painter had been interrupted before the work was done and had not returned to it. The small paintings were different. They were personal in a way the portraits were not. Quick studies, landscapes with figures sketched roughly, and then worked over with more care in places. A woman at a window with her back to the viewer, a child with a dog on a porch step, a man reading at a fire with his shoes off and his feet toward the grate. These were not commissions. They were observations. They were what a painter sees when the people around them have forgotten they are being watched. Walt Seeger sat on the passage floor while Cecilia unrolled paintings, his hands on his knees, and after a while he said there was a woman. He said it the way a man says a thing he has held for a long time and is now able to set down. There was a woman who came through Harlan Bluff in the summer of 1874, he said, with the Lenox Traveling Company out of San Francisco. She was the lead soprano. She sang 4 performances and she stayed 6 weeks, and then she stayed 6 months, and then she did not go back with the company when it left in October. She had a small room above the milliners on First Street. She gave music lessons in the opera house during the week and performed when traveling acts came through. She had a trunk she did not let the porters carry, and she had a painting or 2 on her walls that the milliner's daughter, who had cleaned the room once, had described to Walt as not the sort of thing you saw in a Nevada boarding room. She had a name that Walt pronounced carefully. Adela Oren. Cecilia waited. Walt looked at the unfinished portrait of the older girl for a moment. Then he looked away. She died in the winter of 1875, he said. A fever. She had been here just over a year. There was quiet in the passage for a time, and the cold settled around them both. Cecilia looked at the woman in the 5 portraits, at the quality of attention the painter had given her face, at the alertness in the painted eyes, and understood something about the nature of what was in this room that she had not quite understood before. It was not a collection. It was not an inventory. It was a kept thing. It was the belongings of a woman who had died in a strange town with no family to claim them, and one man who could not bring himself to let them go. She spent 2 more days in the room, cataloging. She worked methodically, the way Eli had taught her to approach any task that required precision, working from the outside in, from the general to the specific, nothing skipped and nothing assumed. She made a written list of every crate and its contents in a small notebook with a pencil she kept sharp with her pocket knife. She noted the condition of every piece. She noted the monogram on the silver, the signatures on the canvases where they were present, and the style of the packing, which told her something about the person who had done it. This was not the work of a hired man following instructions. The shaved pine packing was layered in a particular way, with each piece separated by a thickness of chamois, and then a sheet of plain paper, and then chamois again. The oilskin tubes around the canvases had been sealed at both ends with a rendered tallow compound that had not failed. This was the work of someone who had thought carefully about time. She was not the first person to know what was in this room. Someone had put it here, and that someone had understood what they were putting here, and had wanted it to survive. In the final crate along the west wall, beneath a layer of Excelsior packing, she found a trunk. It was a personal trunk, not large, made of pine and covered in dark leather with brass corner fittings that had gone green. Inside were folded garments, music scores tied in ribbon, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilskin that had been waxed to a near-perfect seal, a folded paper. She opened the oilskin with care and unfolded the paper and read it twice. It was a deed, duly recorded to a quarter section of land east of Harlan Bluff, conveyed in the name of Adela Orrin in October of 1874, signed by a grantor whose name was Amos Percival. She also found, tucked into the lid pocket of the trunk, a small journal the size of a hand, bound in blue cloth, in a very small and precise handwriting that she read only the first page of before she closed it again and set it aside. She had seen enough to understand the shape of the thing. On the fourth day, she wrote a letter to the Reno bank through which the Percival Company paid its taxes, addressed to the estate of whoever held the controlling interest in that company, and stated plainly what she had found, where she had found it, and that the contents were intact. She said she wished to know their proper destination. She did not ask for more than the cost of her work. She mailed the letter at the post office on Sutter Street on a Friday afternoon, when the wind had dropped, and the main street of Harlan Bluff had something like peace in it, the kind of stillness a desert town achieves occasionally in the hour before supper. If you have ever written a letter you were not certain would be answered, you know the particular quality of patience it requires. Cecilia returned to the building each morning and continued working, cleaning the main hall, reseating the iron fixtures that had come loose from the stage floor, doing the ordinary work of a building that has been sealed and needs air and use. Walt Seeger came by most afternoons, not to help precisely, but to watch, which was its own kind of help. He brought coffee twice in a tin pot he carried from the hardware store without comment. He did not ask what she intended to do with the room's contents. He seemed to understand that this was a question for someone else to answer. The reply came 8 days later from a solicitor in San Francisco named Colquitt, and it was 3 pages long. She read it twice at the dressing-room table, with the door to the passage standing open and the cold stone smell coming through. The controlling interest in the Percival Company, the letter explained, had passed upon the death of its sole founder, a Mr. Amos Percival, in 1883 to his daughter. The daughter had made no inquiry regarding the property because she had not known what the property contained, only that her father had paid for its maintenance and had asked her to continue doing so, which she had done, without asking why, because it was the kind of thing her father did, and she had learned not to question the weight he put on certain things. The daughter's name, the solicitor wrote, was Clara. Cecilia set the letter down on the dressing-room table and looked at the ring of rust on the surface where the water pitcher had sat. And she thought about fathers who seal things away because they cannot bear to let them go, and daughters who maintain things they do not understand because love requires it. She thought about her grandfather and the particular way he had folded his diagrams of mortar composition and kept them in the breast pocket of his coat, creased and refold until the creases were soft as cloth. She thought about what it was to carry something for someone who is gone. If there is a word that fits what she felt in that moment, it is not grief, and it is not satisfaction. It is something quieter than either of those, something close to the feeling of finding a thing is as it should be after years of uncertainty about whether anything is as it should be at all. She wrote back to the solicitor. She described the contents precisely, each crate and its contents as she had cataloged them, the paintings and the silver and the trunks and the scores. She described the deed, its date, and the grantor's name, and the quarter section it conveyed. She described the journal and said only that she had not read it beyond the first page, because it had seemed the right thing to do, and still seemed so. She asked whether Clara Percival knew if the woman named in the deed had any surviving family, and she asked what Clara wished done with what was in the room. She did not say that she had understood the room to be an act of care. She did not say that she had come to think well of a man she had never met, who had sealed a building around someone else's life, because he could not find any other way to honor it. These were things she knew and kept to herself. The second letter from the San Francisco solicitor arrived 6 weeks after her first. It was longer and came with 3 enclosures. The first enclosure was a letter from Clara Percival herself, handwritten on good-laid paper, brief and careful, thanking Cecilia and asking several precise questions about the journal and about 2 of the paintings by name, questions that told Cecilia something important. Clara had known about Adela Orrin. She had grown up knowing, in the way children of grieving parents know things that are not explained to them, that there had been someone her father had not recovered from losing, a name he had never spoken but whose weight she had felt in his silences for 20 years. The paintings were not a surprise to Clara. The sealed room was a confirmation of something she had suspected and never spoken of either. The journal was different. The journal was a voice. The second enclosure was a letter from the Carson City Land Office confirming that the quarter section deed was valid and had been duly recorded in the county books, and that no heir had ever presented a claim to the land, and that under Nevada law the matter had a complicated character that the solicitor was prepared to address if Cecilia wished to pursue the matter further. The third enclosure was a bank draft made out in her name, in an amount she read twice, which was $53.20. A note in Clara Percival's hand at the bottom of the draft said only that it was for the wall. Cecilia sat with that for a long moment. Then she folded the draft carefully and put it in the breast pocket of her coat, beside her grandfather's folded diagrams of mortar composition in cold weather, which she had kept there since the day he died. The work of returning what had been sealed took longer than the work of opening it. This was always true in Cecilia's experience. Opening was the action of a moment or a morning, or at most a week. Returning required decision after decision, each one made with attention to what the thing itself required, rather than what was easiest or cheapest. The paintings went to San Francisco in a crate that Cecilia built herself from clear pine, oilskin lined, strapped with new iron banding, packed with shaved pine of her own preparation. She matched, as closely as she could judge, the standard of the original packing, because it seemed the right acknowledgment to make. The silver was cleaned and wrapped and documented and went in a smaller crate, each piece listed against the catalog she sent along. The clothing and scores from the trunks were more complicated. She consulted with the milliner, whose name was Ruth, and who had been in Harlan Bluff since 1870, and had known Adela Orrin well enough to speak of her in the present tense before catching herself, and whose half-blind eyes saw more than most fully sighted ones. They determined together that the scores should go to the nearest music school that would want them, which was in Sacramento. The clothing was past saving in the practical sense, but Ruth said a small thing over the folded dress when they set it aside, very quietly in a voice that did not ask for any response, and Cecilia did not intrude on it. The journal she held for last. It was a difficult question, the journal. It had been written in Adela Oren's own hand, the small, precise handwriting that Cecilia had read one page of, and it contained, so far as she could determine from the portions she read when she finally permitted herself to read them, a true account of what it had been like to live in Harlan Bluff in 1874 and 1875, recording the cold, the music lessons in the opera house on winter mornings when she was the only person in the building, the way the heating stove sounded when it finally caught in the cold air of an early rehearsal, the way the light came through the tall windows at a particular angle in February that was unlike any light she had seen in the cities she had come from. The name Amos Percival appeared in several places, written with a quality that told Cecilia everything she had not needed the journal to understand, because she had already understood it from the room and the paintings and the deed. The journal was private in the truest sense, and it did not belong to Cecilia, and it did not belong to Clara Percival, and what it belonged to was a question neither property law nor sentiment was quite adequate to answer. She sent it to Clara, in the end, with a note that said only that Clara should decide. She received, 3 months later, a single line in response. The journal had been given to the Nevada Historical Archives, where it could be read by anyone who wished to read it. Cecilia thought that was correct. The building itself remained in the question of ownership for 14 months, during which the Percival Company's solicitor and the Harlan Bluff Town Council exchanged letters at the deliberate pace of men who are not being hurried by anything. In the spring of 1889, it was formally transferred to the town, at Clara Percival's direction, for the sum of $1 and the condition that it remain a public hall. The deed restriction said nothing about music. The town council, in a quiet session at the end of April, resolved nonetheless that the hall should be used for music when music was available, and set aside a small amount from the general account for the repair of the walnut front doors and the replacement of 12 of the iron seat fixtures that had corroded past saving. Cecilia was not present for the transfer. She had moved on by then to a commission in the Carson City area involving a collapsed stone mill on the Walker River, which someone needed assessed for foundation integrity and which she had agreed to examine in the early summer. She left Harlan Bluff on a Thursday morning in April, with her grandfather's satchel in the boot of the stage, and the $53.20 mostly spent on necessities, and the knowledge of what she had opened and restored, filed in the particular part of her that kept things without narrating them. Walt Seeger was at the stage stop when she boarded, his hands in his coat pockets and his face arranged in the manner of a man who has something to hand over and is going to do it without ceremony. He said nothing particularly notable. He held out a small paper parcel and waited until she took it, and then he stepped back. She found, when she opened it on the road, a piece of clean oilskin folded to palm size and a short note in his handwriting. For the next wall. She folded the oilskin and put it in the satchel beside the handles of Eli's chisels, where it fit exactly. The Opera House on the corner of Sutter and 2nd Street in Harlan Bluff, Nevada, opened its repaired walnut doors for the first time in 13 years in September of 1889 for a performance by a small vocal quartet passing through from Salt Lake City. Ruth attended, and the mayor attended, and a young woman who had taken music lessons in the room above the milliners attended, and Walt Seeger attended, and sat in one of the 44 original iron and wood seats that someone had cleaned with a rag and a bottle of linseed oil sometime in the weeks before the opening and left smelling of the honest work that had been done to them. The hall was not full. It was perhaps a third full. The quartet sang well, and the acoustics of the room, which had been built by a man who understood sound, were as good as they had ever been, the voices carrying to the back row without strain. There was no plaque anywhere in the building to say what had been found behind the bricked-up wall. There was no ceremony for it. The building had been sealed and opened and restored, and that was a complete thing in itself. And the hall did not require a sign to explain what it was. She was in Carson City that evening, working by lantern light on a preliminary report about a mill foundation on the Walker River. She had her notebook open on the table and her pencil in her hand and her grandfather's satchel at her feet. And the particular stillness that belongs to a woman who has finished one thing and begun another, and knows herself capable of doing what needs to be done. Outside the window, the Carson River was loud with the snowmelt coming down from the Sierra, and the night air smelled of pine and cold water, and the lantern threw its light in a steady circle on her notebook page. What the wall had held was a man's grief and a woman's life, sealed from the light for 11 years, waiting for the right hand and the patience to listen. What opened it was a cold chisel and a 2-pound mallet, and the particular quality of attention that Eli Marsh had taught a young woman in Elko, Nevada, in the years before she needed it. That is not a small inheritance. It never was. If you have ever known something worth preserving, you know something of what it costs to preserve it properly. Leave a word below if this story has stayed with you. There is another one, of the same kind, waiting when you are ready.